Clara Bennett pressed both palms flat against the courthouse steps and did not cry. She had promised herself that much, not here, not in front of them. The ashes of her schoolhouse were still warm 2 streets over, and the town council had just told her in polite and practiced language that Eagle Ridge had no further use for her services. 2 coins left in her coat pocket. Winter coming down off the mountains like a slow death. And not a single soul in that building had the decency to look her in the eye when they said it. If you've ever been discarded by the very people you gave everything to stay with me, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Eagle Ridge, Colorado, 1873, and to a woman who had nothing left but her spine. The council meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Clara knew because she had counted every single one of them standing outside that closed door, listening to the muffled voices decide her fate with the same efficiency they used to approve road repairs and liquor licenses. 11 minutes. That was what 5 years of her life amounted to in Eagle Ridge, Colorado. 11 minutes, and a polite dismissal delivered by Harold Pruitt, chairman of the town council, who had the nerve to fold his hands on the table and say, "We appreciate your dedication, Miss Bennett, but without the schoolhouse, there simply isn't a position for you here." She had nodded. She had thanked him. She had walked out the door without a single tremor in her voice. It was only when she hit the cold air of the street that her legs went unsteady beneath her. She caught herself on the railing and stood there a moment breathing. The sky above Eagle Ridge was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the rooftops like a hand on a sick man's chest. She could smell the ash from 2 streets over. The schoolhouse had caught fire 3 nights ago. A lantern knocked over, they said, though nobody had been in the building after dark, and nobody had bothered to investigate who had been. What remained was a blackened skeleton of timber and the iron school bell, which had fallen into the wreckage and now sat half buried in char like a tombstone. Clara had built that schoolhouse into something. Not with her hands, she was a teacher, not a carpenter, but with her persistence. She had lobbied for new primers when the old ones fell apart. She had organized reading circles for the miners' wives on Saturday mornings. She had stayed late every single evening to work with the children who were too slow or too ashamed to keep up during regular hours. She had given Eagle Ridge 5 years of her life, and Eagle Ridge had given her back 2 months' unpaid wages, a burnt building, and 11 minutes of consideration. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped off the porch. The main street of Eagle Ridge was busy in the way frontier towns were always busy in the hours before a storm. People moving fast, heads down, everyone trying to finish their business before the weather turned. Nobody looked at her. Nobody stopped. The woman who had taught half their children to read was invisible to them now, just another figure in a coat walking toward nothing in particular. She had 2 coins in her pocket. She had counted them that morning, turned them over in her palm, the way you turn over bad news, hoping the second look will change it. It didn't. 2 coins. Enough for a meal maybe if she was careful. Not enough for a room at the boarding house, which Mrs. Holt had already made plain when Clara had asked about credit 2 days ago. "I run a business, Miss Bennett, not a charity," Mrs. Holt had said with that particular smile that was the frontier equivalent of a door slamming in your face. Clara stopped in front of the general store and looked at her own reflection in the glass. She was 26 years old. She had dark eyes, a practical face, and hair she kept pinned up because she had never had the patience for anything decorative. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was, a woman who had worked hard and been sensible and done everything right and still ended up standing on a frozen street with 2 coins and no future. She was so absorbed in that reflection that she almost didn't notice the horse. It was a big animal, a dark bay with a white blaze down its nose tied to the post outside Caldwell's trading post across the street. The horse alone would have drawn attention. It was the kind of animal that cost real money, well fed and well kept, with a saddle that had clearly seen hard use but had been cared for. But it was the man beside it that made Clara look twice. He was enormous. That was the first word that came to her mind, and she didn't apologize for it because there was no more accurate one. He stood well over 6 feet with the kind of build that came not from vanity, but from years of physical work, broad through the shoulders, thick through the arms, with hands that looked capable of splitting timber without an axe. He wore a heavy coat of oiled canvas and a dark hat with the brim pulled low against the wind. His jaw was covered in a short dark beard, and his face, what she could see of it, was weathered in the way that mountain men's faces always were, not old exactly, but marked as if the altitude and the cold had carved character into him, whether he'd wanted it there or not. He was loading supplies onto a pack horse with methodical efficiency, barely glancing at what he was doing as if the work required no thought. But he was watching her. Clara realized it suddenly, that his eyes, dark and still beneath the brim of that hat, were fixed not on his work, but across the street directly on her. She straightened instinctively the way she always did when she felt observed and looked away. She heard his boots on the frozen ground before she saw him move. "Miss." His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man who spoke rarely, and chose his words with the same care he gave his supplies. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. Clara turned. He had crossed the street and was standing about 6 feet from her hat, still on hands loose at his sides. Up close, he was even larger than he'd appeared. She was not a small woman, but she felt small next to him, which she found she didn't like at all. "I don't believe we've met," she said, because it was the only sensible thing to say. "We haven't," he agreed. "Wyatt Callahan. I run a spread up on the north face of the Callahans, the range, not the family, though it's the same name either way." There was no humor in the way he said it. It was simply information. "I come down to Eagle Ridge for supplies about once a month. Heard about your schoolhouse." "Most people have," Clara said. "Heard about the council meeting, too." She looked at him steadily. "Word travels fast in a small town." "It does," he said. "I was in Caldwell's when Pruitt came in to buy tobacco. He wasn't quiet about it." Clara said nothing. She had learned in 5 years of teaching children to behave themselves that silence was often the most powerful response available. Wyatt Callahan looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then said, "You got somewhere to be tonight." The question was so direct, it caught her off guard. "That," she said carefully, "is not the sort of question a stranger ought to ask a woman on the street." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. But it's the sort of question that needs asking when the answer is probably no." He paused. "I'm not trying to insult you, Miss Bennett. I'm trying to ask you something practical, and I'd rather ask it plainly than circle around it and waste both our time." Clara felt the cold working through her coat. She had been standing outside for 20 minutes, and her fingers were beginning to go numb. "Then ask it plainly," she said. He did. "I need a wife," Wyatt Callahan said. "Not for myself particularly, for my boys. I've got 2 sons, Caleb, he's 10, and Seth, he's 7. Their mother died 2 winters ago. They've been without a woman in the house since then, and I can keep them fed, and I can keep them warm, and I can teach them to work, but there are things I can't give them that they need. They need someone who can teach them to read properly, to cipher, to speak to people without sounding like they were raised by wolves, which they mostly were." He said that last part without shame. "I need someone who can do that. In exchange, I can offer you a roof, food, fire, and safety through the winter. Longer if it works." Clara stared at him. She had been proposed to once before by a young man in Ohio who had brought flowers and gone down on one knee and delivered a speech he'd clearly memorized. This was not that. This was a transaction being offered by a large, serious man on a frozen street, spoken in the same tone he might use to negotiate the price of flour. "You are," she said slowly, "offering me a contract marriage." That's one way to put it. What's another way? A practical arrangement between 2 people who each have something the other one needs. She laughed. She couldn't help it, a short, disbelieving sound that had nothing to do with amusement. "Mr. Callahan, I have just been dismissed from my position, had my place of work burned to the ground, and been informed that this town has no further use for me. And now a man I have never met is standing on the street offering to take me up a mountain in exchange for raising his children. Yes," he said simply. That is not an arrangement. That is an insult. Maybe, he said. But it's also a roof. The word landed in the silence between them, with the weight of everything she hadn't said out loud. A roof. She thought of Mrs. Holt's smile. She thought of her 2 coins. She thought of the temperature which was dropping visibly. She could see her own breath now, and his 2 small clouds of vapor hanging in the space between them. I am not a housekeeper, she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. I didn't say you were. I said I need someone who can teach my boys and keep a house running. That's different from a servant. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it sounds considerably similar. Wyatt Callahan was quiet for a moment. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked, she thought, like a man who had anticipated this conversation and had decided in advance to simply wait it out. Miss Bennet, he said at last, I'm not going to argue with you about whether the offer is fair, because I don't know if it is. What I know is that it's real, and it's standing in front of you. And the alternative you've got is 2 coins and a town that's already decided it's done with you. Clara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the temperature, because he was right, and she hated that he was right, and she hated even more that a man she had never spoken to before this afternoon had assessed her situation with more accuracy than the people who had known her for 5 years. I want it in writing, she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. All right. I want it stated clearly that I am not your property, that I have the right to leave if the arrangement proves untenable, that my position in the house is not that of a servant and will not be treated as such. I can write that down, he said. And I want to be introduced to your sons before I agree to anything permanent. I will not walk into a household blind. That's fair. And I want... She stopped, looked at him. You're agreeing to everything. You're asking for reasonable things, he said. She studied his face, looking for the angle for the thing he wasn't saying. In her experience, men who agreed to everything in the beginning were the ones who remembered nothing later. But his expression was flat and honest, in a way that was almost uncomfortable, as if he had nothing to hide and no interest in pretending otherwise. Why me? She asked quietly. You could have found a woman from the church or written to an agency. Why are you standing on a street corner offering this to a woman you don't know? Wyatt. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Because I watched you walk out of that courthouse, he said, and you didn't cry. And I need someone who doesn't fall apart when things get hard, Miss Bennet, because where I live, things are hard. Clara stood very still. She thought about crying, actually, about what it would have cost her to cry on those courthouse steps in front of those men who had decided her worth in 11 minutes. She thought about how much energy she had spent every day for 5 years being competent and unbreakable and useful, and how none of it had mattered in the end, because the schoolhouse burned, and the council had already made up their minds before she walked through the door. She looked at the sky. It was getting darker. She thought of the mountain, and of 2 boys she had never met, and of a man who spoke like a contract and moved like weather. I'll need to collect my things from the boarding house, she said. I'll wait, he said. I have a trunk and a book crate. I've got room on the pack horse. She nodded once stiffly and turned to walk back toward the boarding house. She had gone about 6 steps when she stopped and turned back. Mr. Callahan. He was watching her. He hadn't moved. If you are not a man of your word, she said, I will find a way to make that known. I have taught half the children in this valley to read. I know where all the pens are. For the first time since he'd crossed the street, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was something. Noted, he said. She went to collect her trunk. Mrs. Holt was behind the desk when Clara came through the door, and she looked up with that same practiced expression of sympathy that meant she was about to say something unkind in a kind voice. Miss Bennet, I was just going to send someone. I'm collecting my things, Clara said, moving past her toward the stairs. I'll be out within the hour. Oh. A pause. And where will you be? That. Clara said without turning around, is no longer any concern of yours. She went up the stairs and into the small room that had been her home for the past 2 months. The only home available after the rental on her schoolhouse lodging had gone up in the same fire that took everything else. The room was spare and cold, and she had never liked it. She packed her trunk with practiced efficiency: 2 dresses, her teaching books, her mother's Bible, a small tin of correspondence she kept out of habit, her writing kit. The book crate took longer because books were heavy, and she was not willing to leave a single one behind, not even the arithmetic primers she had bought with her own money 3 years ago. She carried them down herself. She did not ask Mrs. Holt for help. Wyatt Callahan was standing exactly where she'd left him, which surprised her more than she expected it to. She had half believed coming down the boarding house steps with her trunk that he would be gone, that the whole conversation would turn out to be some elaborate misunderstanding, or a dream produced by cold and exhaustion. But he was there, and he took the trunk from her without comment and lashed it onto the packhorse with the same methodical efficiency he'd shown loading his supplies. "Book crate too," Clara said. He looked at the crate. He looked at the packhorse. He rearranged several things without complaint and secured the crate alongside the trunk. "Ready?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." He handed her up onto his horse, which was taller than she'd realized, and required a genuinely undignified amount of effort to mount in her skirts. He swung up behind her without apparent difficulty, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue at the animal. Eagle Ridge fell away behind them. She did not look back. She wasn't sure if that was courage or simply the inability to face what she was leaving, and at that moment she decided it didn't matter. The horse moved north toward the mountains, and the mountains were white at their peaks and dark at their bases, and absolutely enormous against the gray sky. And Clara Bennett sat up straight in the saddle and told herself the same thing she had told herself every morning for the past 5 years, when the work was hard and the town was ungrateful and the cold came through the schoolhouse walls. "You have survived everything so far." Wyatt Callahan rode in silence, which she found she preferred to false comfort. The wind picked up as they climbed out of the valley, and the trail narrowed, and the temperature dropped another degree for every 100 feet they gained in elevation. The packhorse behind them moved with the steady resignation of an animal that had made this trip many times. After an hour, she said, "Tell me about your sons." He was quiet for a moment, as if considering how honest to be. "Caleb is 10. He's smarter than me probably, which I mean as a genuine observation, not a boast. He reads some already, but not well. He thinks fast and talks too much when he's nervous, and not at all when he's angry." Another pause. "He's been angry for 2 years. Clara said nothing. "Seth is 7. He doesn't talk much under any circumstances. He follows Caleb everywhere, does what Caleb does, thinks what Caleb thinks. If you want to reach Seth, you reach Caleb first." He paused again. "They are not easy." "No child in grief is easy," Clara said. He seemed to consider that. "No," he said finally. "I reckon not." The trail climbed on. The trees thickened around them, dark pine heavy with old snow. Somewhere above the Callahan Range rose against the sky, like a wall built to keep the rest of the world out. Clara looked at it and thought about the 2 boys waiting in a cabin at the top of that climb, wild and motherless and full of anger she hadn't caused and would have to face anyway. She thought about the contract she had demanded, which Wyatt Callahan had agreed to, with barely a pause. She thought about what he had said on the street, that he needed someone who didn't fall apart when things got hard. She pressed her lips together and watched the mountain coming toward her. She was going to need every single one of those books. The light was beginning to fail when the cabin came into view through the trees, a low, solid structure of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney pushing gray smoke into the darkening sky. There was a barn to one side, a woodpile that Clara estimated as taller than she was, and a cleared yard that showed signs of hard use. A dog somewhere started barking and then went quiet. 2 figures appeared in the cabin doorway as Wyatt pulled the horse to a stop. They were silhouetted against the firelight inside, and Clara could not make out their faces, only their shapes, one taller, one smaller, standing shoulder to shoulder in the way that children do when they are uncertain and trying not to look it. Wyatt dismounted first and reached up to help her down. She took his hand, large and rough and steady, and stepped down into the snow. The two boys stared at her. She stared back. "Boys," Wyatt said without preamble. "This is Miss Clara Bennett. She's going to be staying with us." The taller one, Caleb, she knew, already said nothing. He looked at her with dark eyes that were his father's eyes, clear and still, and giving nothing away. The smaller one, Seth, pressed closer to his brother's side. "I ain't calling her Ma," Caleb said. "Nobody asked you to," Wyatt said. Clara looked at the boy and thought of every child she had ever taught who had walked into her classroom with a wall already built, daring her to try to get past it. She had taken down most of those walls eventually, not by force, but by patience, and by showing up every single day until the child understood she wasn't going anywhere. "You can call me Miss Bennett," she said, her voice steady. "That's what the children in Eagle Ridge called me, and it suited me fine." Caleb stared at her. Seth said nothing. "Can we go inside?" Clara asked, addressing Wyatt. "It's cold." "Yes," he said, and stepped past the boys and into the cabin. Clara followed. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked through the door, took in the interior with a single practiced scan, rough but solid, warmer than she'd expected. A fireplace doing real work. A table scarred with use. 2 beds in the back corner, a loft above, and turned around to find both boys watching her from the doorway. She looked at them. They looked at her. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting the heat out." There was a pause. Then Seth, the small one, reached back and pulled the door shut. It was not much, but it was the first thing either of them had done at her direction, and Clara Bennett filed it away carefully, the way she had always filed away the small victories, quietly, privately, as evidence that the wall was not as solid as it looked. Outside, the wind off the Callahan Range struck the cabin walls and moved on. The fire burned. The boys watched her from across the room. Wyatt Callahan moved to the far end of the cabin to see to his gear, leaving her alone with 2 children who didn't want her there in a house she didn't know, on a mountain that didn't care whether she made it through the winter. Clara took off her coat, hung it on the peg by the door, smoothed her dress, turned to the fireplace, and began to assess what there was to work with for supper. She had survived everything so far. She meant to keep going. Supper that first night was a disaster, and Clara knew it before she ever touched the pan. There was salt pork in the larder, dried beans that had been soaking since morning. She found them in a clay pot near the fire, which told her Wyatt had at least planned to feed his sons before he rode into Eagle Ridge, and a half sack of cornmeal that had seen better days. She worked quietly and without complaint, because complaining required an audience willing to care, and the 2 boys sitting at the table behind her were not that audience. She could feel them watching her the way cats watch something they haven't decided about yet. Not hostile precisely, but waiting for a reason to become hostile. She set the pan on the iron hook over the fire, added the pork, and listened to it hiss. "That ain't how Pa does it," Caleb said. Clara did not turn around. "How does your father do it?" "He does the beans first, always beans first." "The beans aren't ready yet. They need another hour." "Then we wait." "You've been waiting since morning," she said. "You'll eat now." Silence. She could feel it thickening behind her, the way silence does when a child is deciding whether to push further or retreat. She kept her attention on the pan. She was not going to turn around and give him the satisfaction of seeing that the tension in the room had registered. "Seth ain't hungry anyway," Caleb said. "Seth can speak for himself," Clara said. Another silence. Then very quietly from the small one, "I'm a little hungry." Caleb shot his brother a look that could have cured leather. Seth dropped his eyes to the table and said nothing else, but the damage was done. He had spoken, and the word had been honest, and Clara filed that away the same way she'd filed the closed door. Wyatt came in from the barn when the food was nearly ready, stamping snow off his boots, and sat at the head of the table without ceremony. He looked at the pan, looked at the boys, looked at Clara, and said nothing. She served him first, not out of deference, but because he was the largest person in the room and the most likely to require the most fuel, then served the boys, then herself. Caleb stared at his plate. "We say grace," he said. It had the sound of a test. "Then say it," Clara said. He blinked. He'd expected, she thought, to catch her out to prove she was an interloper who didn't know their ways. He hadn't expected her to simply hand it back to him. He folded his hands, muttered a grace that was brief and genuine, in a way that told her someone had taught him properly once, and then picked up his fork. They ate in silence. It was the kind of silence that presses on a room, not the comfortable quiet of people who know each other well enough not to need words, but the brittle, watchful silence of four people who are strangers sharing a table and trying to determine the rules. Clara ate her salt pork and listened to the wind push at the cabin walls and thought, "This is what I agreed to. This is what the next weeks will look like." She had known it would be hard. She had not known it would feel so specifically like being an intruder in someone else's grief. When supper was done, Wyatt pushed back from the table and looked at her. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." It was the loft. She had suspected it would be, and she was right. A rope ladder, a wool mattress, 2 blankets. Wyatt handed her up a candle and said, "It's warmer than it looks. Heat rises." "I'm aware of how heat works," she said, and then felt immediately unkind for saying it, because he was not being condescending, he was simply informing her in his flat and practical way, and she was letting her exhaustion speak for her. "Thank you," she added more quietly. He nodded. No offense taken, apparently. He went back to the table where Caleb was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a boy cataloging information for future use. "Bed," Wyatt said to both boys. "It's early," Caleb said. "It's dark," Wyatt said. "Same thing up here." Clara climbed the rope ladder with as much dignity as a woman in skirts could manage, which was not much, and settled herself on the mattress with her candle and her mother's Bible, and the particular ache that comes from a day that has rearranged your entire life without asking permission. She could hear the boys below, the sounds of boots being pulled off, Wyatt banking the fire, the creak of the cabin settling in the cold. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of a household functioning. She was part of it now, whether it wanted her or not. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain. It was louder than she'd expected. Wind in the pines, something shifting in the barn, the horses probably, and once far off the cry of something wild that she couldn't name. She had lived in town for 5 years, surrounded by the sounds of people, and she had forgotten what real silence sounded like. It didn't sound like silence at all. It sounded like the world reminding you that it was very large and you were very small. She slept eventually out of sheer depletion. Morning came in gray and hard. Clara was up before the boys and had water on before Wyatt came in from whatever he'd been doing in the barn since what sounded from above like 4 in the morning. He looked at the pot, then at her, and she thought she saw something register in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. The recognition that something had been done that he hadn't had to do. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." It was the first word of actual courtesy he had directed at her, and she felt it land with more weight than it should have. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat across the table with her own cup, and they drank in silence while the cabin slept around them. After a while, Wyatt said, "Caleb will be trouble." "I know," she said. "He's not bad. He's just—" He stopped, turned the cup in his hands. "He was the one who found her, his mother. She'd been sick 3 days, and I was out checking the upper line, and he was the one who—" He stopped again. Clara said nothing. She waited. "He was 8, Wyatt said. The 2 words sat between them like something that had been put down carefully and couldn't be picked back up. "He blames himself," she said. "He blames everyone," Wyatt said. "Himself included, but mostly everyone." He looked up at her. "I'm telling you so you understand why he pushes. It's not about you." "It's never about the teacher," Clara said quietly. "It's always about the thing the teacher walked in after." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "You understand that. I taught for 5 years," she said. Every child who ever sat in my classroom was carrying something. The ones who caused the most trouble were usually carrying the heaviest load. She paused. Caleb will be fine. He just needs to know I'm not going anywhere. They always test that first. Wyatt was quiet. Then, what about Seth? Seth, Clara said, is watching Caleb to learn how to feel. If I reach Caleb, Seth will follow. She looked at her cup. Give me 2 weeks. He didn't respond to that which she had come to understand in less than 12 hours was his way of indicating agreement. He simply picked up his cup and finished his coffee and said, I'll be in the upper pasture most of the day. There's a fence line that needs checking before the next storm comes in. When will the next storm come in? 3 days, maybe 2. He was up and gone before the boys woke. Caleb came down the ladder, first dropped the last 2 rungs because he always did, and looked at the table. Clara had made cornmeal mush and set out the small jar of sorghum she'd found in the back of the larder. Caleb looked at the mush. He looked at the sorghum. He looked at Clara. Pa makes eggs, he said. Your father is in the upper pasture. Clara said. Sit down. There's hens in the barn. I'm aware. I'll collect eggs tomorrow. This morning we have mush. I don't like mush. I don't particularly care, Clara said pleasantly and set a bowl in front of him. The sound Caleb made was something between a scoff and a growl, but he sat. Seth came down the ladder in the careful, deliberate way of a child who doesn't trust his own body yet, and settled into his chair without comment. Clara set a bowl in front of him, and he picked up his spoon immediately, which made Caleb look at him with open irritation. You're just gonna eat it, Caleb demanded. It's hot, Seth said quietly, and spooned mush into his mouth. Caleb stared at his brother. Then, in the manner of a boy who has lost an argument before it started, he picked up his own spoon. Clara sat at her end of the table and ate her mush and thought 2 weeks. The morning was hers to organize, because Wyatt had said nothing about what he expected during the hours he was away, and Clara had decided in the absence of instruction to use the time she knew how to use school time. She cleared the breakfast dishes, put the kitchen in order, and then went to her book crate and began pulling volumes. What are you doing? Caleb asked. He'd been watching her from across the room, pretending to whittle something with a small knife, pretending poorly. Getting your lessons ready, Clara said. The whittling stopped. We don't do lessons. You do now. Pa didn't say anything about lessons. Your father told me, Clara said, setting a primer on the table, that you need to read properly and cipher and learn to speak to people without sounding like you were raised by wolves. Those are his words, not mine. She paused. Come and sit down. The silence from across the room was so complete she could hear the fire breathing. I ain't a child, Caleb said. You're 10 years old, Clara said. Which means you are in fact a child. Sit down. You can't make me. No, she agreed. I can't. But I can tell your father tonight that you refused, and I can let him decide what that means. She kept her voice even. Not threatening, she wasn't interested in threats. Threats made children dig in. She was simply stating facts the way Wyatt stated facts because she had already learned in one evening that this household ran on plain speech. Or you can sit down, and we can get through an hour of reading, and then you can go do whatever it is you do on this mountain for the rest of the day. Caleb stared at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were hot, and she could see performing the internal calculation that 10-year-olds performed when faced with an adult who wasn't flinching. He was measuring her. She let him measure. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, she agreed. He crossed the room and sat with all the enthusiasm of a man approaching an execution. Seth, without being asked, got up from his corner and dragged his chair to the table and sat beside his brother. Clara opened the primer. She started. Not at the beginning. Caleb would have raged at being started at the beginning, and she had no interest in unnecessary battles, but in the middle, at a passage she could use to assess quickly where he actually was. She read a few lines aloud, then pushed the book across to him. He picked it up, held it at an angle that told her his vision was fine, read slowly, but with the particular hesitation of a boy who could do it and didn't want to show it. She let him struggle with 2 words without helping, because the struggle was important, and then quietly supplied the third when he'd been stuck long enough that embarrassment was beginning to set in. By the end of the hour, she knew where both boys stood. Caleb was 2 grades behind where a 10-year-old should be, but the gap was closable. There was nothing wrong with his mind, only the 2 years of neglect and grief that had eaten his schooling. Seth at 7 was closer to his level than his brother, and she suspected was being deliberately cautious about showing it, letting Caleb stay ahead so as not to threaten the hierarchy between them. When the hour was done, Caleb shut the book with more force than necessary and shoved back from the table. "Are we done?" "For this morning," Clara said. He was gone out the door before she could say anything else. Seth lingered just barely a half-second longer than his brother. He looked at the primer. Then he looked up at Clara. "I like the one about the river," he said quietly. "The story, with the man in the boat." It took her a moment to understand he was referring to a different book, one he must have seen sticking out of her crate when she was unpacking. "Huckleberry Finn," she said. He nodded very small. "We'll get to that," she said. "Once your reading is a little stronger." He thought about this. "How long?" "Not as long as you think," she said. He nodded again and went out after his brother. Clara sat alone at the table with the primer in front of her, and let out a long, slow breath, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this cabin on this mountain. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as hope. The days that followed moved in a pattern that she imposed, and Wyatt allowed, and the boys resisted, and gradually, incrementally, stopped resisting. Morning lessons. Afternoon chores. She had asked Wyatt on the second night to designate tasks for the boys in the afternoon, because children without structure became small disasters, and she had enough to manage without adding that. He had agreed with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and the next morning he had told Caleb and Seth in about 12 words total what they were expected to do and when. Caleb had objected. Wyatt had looked at him. The objection had ended. She noticed that about him the way he managed the boys with almost no words. It wasn't cruelty and it wasn't indifference. It was the particular authority of a man who had learned that in wilderness economy was survival, and that extended to language as much as anything else. He didn't explain himself, and he didn't negotiate, and he didn't punish beyond consequence. And the boys who had spent 2 years navigating their own grief inside the structure of his wordless discipline understood the grammar of it fluently. What they didn't understand yet was her. She was noisier for one thing. Not loud, she was not a loud woman, but she asked questions and required answers and had opinions about things like how the table was set, and whether the boots belonged inside the door or outside it, and why the cornmeal sack had been left open and attracting mice when there was a perfectly good tin with a lid on the shelf directly above it. These were not unreasonable positions. But they were positions which was more than the cabin had been required to accommodate in 2 years, and it showed. Caleb, in particular, treated every question like a provocation. The confrontation that had been building since the first supper arrived on the 6th day in the middle of an arithmetic lesson that was going badly because Caleb had decided, for reasons Clara suspected had nothing to do with arithmetic, that he was not going to give an inch. 6 times 8, Clara said. Don't know. You do know. We covered this yesterday. Don't remember. Caleb. What? He looked up, and his eyes were all defiance, full and hot, and completely uninterested in multiplication. What do you want from me? I said I don't know. I don't know and I don't care, and you can't make me care, so what do you want? I want you to try, Clara said. Why? What's the point? There ain't a school up here. There ain't anybody up here. What does 6 times 8 matter when you're on a mountain in the middle of nowhere, and your ma is dead, and your pa went and brought home a stranger and called her? He stopped. His voice had cracked on the last word, which she thought he hadn't expected, and the crack embarrassed him. And the embarrassment turned immediately to anger, the way it always did with boys his age. She ain't anything, he said fierce and low. She ain't our ma, and she ain't our teacher, and she got no right to sit here telling us what to do, like she belongs here. Clara looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for him. She sat very still for a moment, the way you sit still near something wild that is frightened." And then she said, "You're right." He blinked. "I'm not your mother," she said. "I'm not trying to be. I'm not going to pretend that what happened to your family didn't happen, or that my being here makes it hurt less, because I don't believe either of those things." She kept her voice level. "What I know is that 6 times 8 is 48, and that one day when you are off this mountain and out in the world, that will matter. And your mother would have wanted you to know it." The room went so quiet, she could hear the snow on the roof. Caleb's jaw worked. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger. He looked down at the table. 48, he said. His voice was stripped of everything except the number. "That's right," Clara said softly. He didn't look up. She didn't push. They moved on to the next problem, and if his handwriting was more forceful than usual, for the rest of the lesson. She chose to interpret that as energy finding an outlet, which was, she had always believed, the primary purpose of arithmetic. That evening, while Clara was at the fire stirring the beans, she had learned to do the beans first. Some battles were not worth fighting. She heard Wyatt come in behind her, and there was something different about the sound of his boots on the floor, some change in rhythm that made her turn. He had a piece of paper in his hand. It was the contract. She recognized it. She had written it out herself on her second morning there, in her clearest hand, both copies, and Wyatt had read it in silence and signed both without comment and given her one without a word. She had folded it and put it in her book crate. He was holding his copy. "Caleb told me what he said to you today," Wyatt said. Clara turned back to the beans. "It wasn't anything I didn't expect. He had no business. He's 10 years old, and he lost his mother, and his world has been rearranged twice in 2 years," Clara said. "He had every business. It needed to come out." She paused. "Did he tell you what he said or what I said back?" "A beat." "Both." "Then you know it's handled." The silence behind her had a different texture now. She kept stirring. "You didn't come down and tell me," Wyatt said. "I didn't need to. Most women would have." Clara set the spoon on the hook and turned to face him. He was still holding the contract, which she found curious. "Mr. Callahan, I am not most women. I am the specific woman who agreed to come up this mountain in November, and I am standing in your kitchen handling it. If I come to you with a problem, you will know it's a real problem." She paused. "What are you holding the contract for?" He looked down at it as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. "I was going to—" He stopped, set it on the table. "I wanted you to know that I'll honor it. Everything that's in it." Clara looked at him. Really looked the way she hadn't allowed herself to in the week they'd been sharing this space, because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging made it real. He was a large, contained, difficult man, standing in his own kitchen, holding a piece of paper, like it was something he needed her to see him holding, and she understood suddenly that this was him being uncertain. This was Wyatt Callahan, not knowing how to say a thing, and finding the only instrument he had, which was this document, and using it. "I know you will," she said more quietly than she'd intended. He nodded, picked up the contract folded, put it in his coat pocket, said nothing else. She turned back to the beans. After a moment, she heard him cross to the far corner of the room to deal with his gear, and the ordinary sounds of the cabin reasserted themselves around her, and she found she was gripping the spoon harder than she needed to. She let it go, kept stirring. Outside, the wind was picking up, which meant the storm was arriving early, and she added another log to the fire without being asked, because she had learned in 6 days to read this cabin, the way she read a classroom, by the way it breathed, by what it needed, before it said so. The storm hit that night and did not stop for 2 days. They were locked in, all 4 of them, in the way mountain winters had of making the cabin simultaneously smaller and more important. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do but be in the same space, which forced a proximity that Clara suspected was more effective than anything she might have planned deliberately. She taught in the mornings. The boys did their chores in the afternoons, which consisted during a storm of splitting wood from the covered pile beside the barn door and keeping the animal water unfrozen. Wyatt repaired equipment. There was always equipment that needed repair at the far end of the table. Clara read in the evenings, or wrote letters she couldn't yet send, or sat by the fire working on the rip in her spare dress that had been needing attention since Eagle Ridge. On the second storm evening, Seth climbed onto the bench beside her while she was sewing and watched her hands. "What's that stitch?" he asked. "Blanket stitch," she said. "For the edge." "Can I learn?" She handed him the needle and thread without comment and showed him the motion, and he practiced on a scrap of cloth she tore from the hem of the dress, his tongue between his teeth completely absorbed. Across the room, Caleb watched from under his lashes and said nothing, which Clara knew meant he was watching closely. When Seth held up his scrap of cloth and said, "Is that right?" with the total solemn earnestness of a 7-year-old who has taken a task seriously, Clara looked at it. The stitches uneven, too wide in some places and too close in others, but structurally sound, and said, "That's exactly right." Seth beamed. It was the first time she had seen him beam at anything. Caleb looked away fast, like he'd been caught caring about something. Clara bent back to her sewing. The storm broke on the morning of the third day, and Wyatt was out before the sky had fully lightened, checking the animals, the fence, the upper pasture. Clara sent the boys out after breakfast to dig the path clear between the cabin and the barn, and stood at the window watching them, while she washed the dishes and let herself feel for the first time since she'd come up this mountain, something that was not either determination or exhaustion. She was not sure yet what to call it. Caleb was showing Seth the correct way to use the snow shovel, which involved a great deal of demonstration and correction, and at one point, Seth throwing a handful of snow at his brother's back for reasons that appeared to be purely because he could. Caleb turned around with an expression of absolute outrage that collapsed within about 4 seconds into something that was nearly a smile. He packed a snowball in return. Seth ran. They were loud about it in the way boys are loud when they forget to be sad, and Clara stood at the window and watched it happen, and thought about 2 winters of motherless grief, locked up in this cabin, and what it cost a child to carry a weight like that. She was still standing there when Wyatt came in from outside and stamped the snow off his boots and stopped when he saw her expression. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She turned back to the dishes. "Your boys are throwing snow at each other." A pause. Then she heard him cross to the window, and the silence that followed was a different kind of silence, and she didn't look at him during it because she thought he might not want to be looked at just then. "First time I've heard Seth laugh in a while," he said quietly. "I know," she said, equally quiet. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he went back to his coat without another word, and she went back to the dishes, and outside in the snow, his sons hollered at each other, and the sound came through the cabin walls bright and startling and entirely alive. That evening, when the boys were in their beds and the fire had burned down to coals, Wyatt sat at the table with the day's accounts book. He kept careful records of supplies and weather and pasture conditions she had learned, and Clara sat across from him with her writing, and the quiet between them was for the first time not uncomfortable. It was, she thought, the quiet of 2 people who have been in the same difficult situation long enough to stop being strangers and not yet started being anything else. She didn't examine it further. She was not by temperament a woman who examined things before they were ready to be examined. She finished her letter, folded it for the next time someone went to Eagle Ridge, and said, "Good night, Mr. Callahan." "Good night, Miss Bennett," he said without looking up. She climbed the rope ladder to the loft. The mountain pressed around the cabin in all directions, dark and enormous and indifferent. But inside the coals were warm, and she could hear Wyatt turning the page of his accounts book below her, and Seth's slow sleeping breath from the corner, and somewhere distant, an owl calling out once, and then going quiet. She had been here 10 days. She had arrived a stranger on a mountain that didn't want her in a house that had never asked for her, and somewhere between the salt pork and the arithmetic and the snowball in Seth's face, something had shifted in the weight of the place, some small but irreversible change in the balance of the cabin's gravity. She pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes, and thought about what she had told Wyatt that morning, "Give me 2 weeks," and thought that she might not have needed quite that long. But she did not say that out loud, because some things needed to be earned in their own time, and she had learned in 10 days on a mountain in November that Wyatt Callahan's household ran not on words but on acts, and that the acts were beginning slowly to accumulate. Whatever they were accumulating into, she would wait to see it take shape. She was good at waiting. She was good at showing up. She had been showing up her entire life for people who didn't know yet that they needed her, and she had never stopped. She did not intend to stop now. The mountain held the cabin in its dark, cold hands. The fire breathed. The wind moved through the pines in the long, patient way of things that have been there forever and will be there long after. Clara Bennett slept. She woke on the 11th day to the sound of Caleb crying. Not the loud performative crying of a child wanting attention. She had heard plenty of that in 5 years of teaching and knew its particular rhythm. This was the other kind. The quiet, held-in kind that a boy makes when he thinks no one can hear him, when he has been swallowing something for so long that it finally comes up on its own in the dark hours before dawn. It came through the loft floor in broken intervals, muffled against something, a pillow, a sleeve, and Clara lay completely still and listened and made no sound. She did not go down. She understood with the particular instinct of someone who had spent years reading children that going down would be the wrong move. Caleb needed to not be caught. He needed the cry to be his alone, unwitnessed, unrecorded, in the ledger of things adults had seen him do. She lay still and listened until it stopped, and then listened to the silence after it, and then heard him turn over in his bed and go quiet in the way of someone who has finally emptied something out. She stared at the ceiling of the loft for a long time after that. In the morning she made eggs. She had been collecting them from the barn hens since the 3rd day, working around the rooster, who had opinions about her presence and expressed them loudly, and she made them the way she had noticed Caleb watched her hands, when she cooked with the focused peripheral attention of a child who is learning something without admitting he is learning it. She scrambled them with a little salt and the dried onion she'd found in the back of the larder, and she set the plate in front of him without comment, and he ate every bite without complaint. That was the morning he stopped fighting the lessons. He didn't announce it. He didn't apologize. He simply sat down at the table when she opened the primer and picked up his pencil and did the work. It was not warm. It was not even civil exactly, but it was present, and presence was the thing she had been asking for. And she accepted it the same way she'd accepted everything else in this cabin, which was quietly and without making it larger than it was. Seth, who had been watching his brother for the signal. The way he always watched his brother for the signal, relaxed visibly. He sat up straighter. He raised his hand before answering a question for the first time, which made Clara want to smile so much she had to look down at the primer to hide it. The days between the 11th and the 20th were the closest thing to ordinary that the cabin had produced since Clara arrived. Not easy, ordinary, and easy were not the same thing, and she had stopped expecting easy sometime around day 3, but functional. Patterned. The kind of days that stack on top of each other without drama, and build something out of their accumulation. She taught in the mornings, and managed the house in the afternoons, and cooked supper, and sat across the table from Wyatt in the evenings, and did not examine the quality of those evenings too carefully. He was teaching her the mountain in the same way he taught everything, without preamble, without ceremony, in small increments offered as utility rather than gift. He told her which direction the wind changed before a storm. He told her what the light on the upper peaks meant about the temperature. He showed her how to bank the fire so it would hold all night with one less log than she'd been using his hands over hers on the iron poker for less than 3 seconds, adjusting the angle, then gone. She thought about those 3 seconds more than was useful. On the 20th day, Caleb asked her a question that was not about arithmetic. They were at the table. She was correcting his writing exercise. He was pretending not to watch her face for her reaction, when he said without looking up from his work, "Did you ever have a husband before?" Clara set down the pencil. "No," she said. "Why not?" "I was busy teaching." He considered this. "Did you want one?" "I hadn't thought about it much." "Pa didn't want one either," Caleb said. "A wife, I mean. He said once that Ma was—" He stopped. The pencil moved on the paper unnecessarily. He said once that she was the only woman he ever met who could keep up with him. Up here, I mean. On the mountain. He paused. Most women couldn't. Clara looked at him steadily. Is that a warning or an observation? Caleb looked up, then surprised, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth do something. Observation, he said. Noted, she said and picked up the pencil again. But she felt him watching her for the rest of the lesson, and the quality of the watching had changed. It was not the measuring for threat attention of the first 2 weeks, but something that lived closer to assessment, the kind a person does when they are beginning to revise an opinion they'd already made up their mind about. She did not address it directly. She simply kept correcting his work, marking the letters that needed to be formed more carefully, noting where his argument in the writing exercise had logic, and where it had gaps, treating him exactly as she would have treated a student in Eagle Ridge who was beginning to take his work seriously. She gave him a score at the bottom of the page, the way she always had a number out of 10, the same system she'd used in the schoolhouse. He had earned an 8. She wrote it clearly and handed the paper back. He stared at it. 8, he said. You lost points for the letter formation, and for the conclusion which didn't follow from the evidence you'd built. What would a 10 look like? It was the best question he had asked her since she'd arrived. Show me tomorrow, she said, and I'll tell you. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. She had not expected that. She had thought he'd leave it on the table the way he'd left everything the first week. He put it in his pocket and went outside without another word, and she sat at the empty table and looked at the space where he'd been sitting, and felt in a way she hadn't been prepared for the particular quiet joy of watching a closed thing begin very slowly to open. It was Seth who undid her 3 days later. She was at the fire when she heard the rope ladder creak and turned to find him coming down in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual. The boys were supposed to be doing their chores, and Seth, whatever his other qualities, was reliable about chores, in the way that youngest children often are, compensating with compliance for what they lack in size. She waited. He crossed the room to her, stopped about 2 feet away, and held out something in his closed fist. What's this? She asked. He opened his hand. In his palm was a small stone, rounded, smooth, pale gray, with a single vein of white running through it like a river on a map. It was the kind of stone a child picks up because it catches the light a certain way, because it feels right in the hand, for no reason that makes sense to an adult. It's mine, he said. My best one. I found it in the creek in summer. He pushed his hand toward her slightly. You can have it. Clara looked at the stone, then at Seth, who was watching her with the complete, earnest vulnerability of a 7-year-old offering his best thing and not entirely certain it would be accepted. She took it. Thank you, Seth, she said, and her voice came out steadier than it deserved to. I'll keep it safe. He nodded, satisfied, and went back up the ladder without another word. She stood at the fire and looked at the stone in her palm, small and smooth and unremarkable, and entirely extraordinary, and thought, this is what you showed up for. This specific moment. Not the arithmetic scores, and not the dinners, and not the contract in the book crate, but this. A child who had been in grief for 2 years, deciding on an ordinary afternoon that she was worth giving his best stone to. She put it in her dress pocket and kept it there. That evening, she told Wyatt about it, which surprised her. She had not planned to, had not decided to, but they were sitting in their habitual evening quiet, and something made her say it. Seth gave me a stone today, she said. His best one, he said. Wyatt looked up from his accounts book. His expression was still in the way it was always still, but something moved behind it. He showed me that stone in July, he said. Carried it everywhere for 2 months. I know, she said, because she had understood that when Seth said it was his best one. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his accounts. But later, when she was climbing the rope ladder, he said without looking up, You're doing well, Miss Bennett. She stopped on the 3rd rung. She thought about several things she could say to that, deflections, qualifications, the professional modesty of a teacher used to being evaluated. She discarded all of them. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, she said simply, and climbed the rest of the way up, In the loft, she lay in the dark and pressed her hand against her dress pocket and felt the small, hard shape of Seth's stone, and stared at the ceiling and understood that something in the cabin had shifted again, not the small shift of Caleb sitting down to his lessons without being asked, not the medium shift of Seth giving her his stone, but something larger and less definable. Something in the atmosphere of the place itself, in the particular quality of the silence between her and the man sitting at the table below. She identified it carefully, the way you identify something in the dark, by touch rather than sight. It was not romance. She was clear about that she was a practical woman, and she did not have the luxury of romantic sentiment, and she was not in any case the kind of person who moved quickly toward things she couldn't yet see the edges of. It was not romance. But it was something, and the something had weight, and she felt it press against her chest in a way that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. She turned over and went to sleep before she could examine it further. 3 days later, Wyatt came in at midday, looking like weather. She knew his face well enough by then to read its weather the way she'd learned to read the mountain's weather from the way he'd described it. The light on the upper peaks, the direction of the wind. When he was simply tired, he moved slowly and spoke in shorter sentences. When he was worried about the animals, or the fence line, or the supply situation, he had a specific stillness about him, a held quality, like a man carrying something fragile. She had not until that afternoon seen him angry. He came through the door and set his hat on the peg with more force than usual, which was the only sign. Everything else about him was controlled. "Where are the boys?" he asked. "Caleb's in the barn. Seth's at the table with his primer." Clara looked at him. "What happened?" "Nothing the boys need to hear about." "Then tell me," she said. He looked at her. She didn't look away. After a moment he sat at the table. Seth glanced up from his primer, read his father's face with the practiced accuracy of a child who has been reading that face since birth, and quietly picked up his book and went to the far corner of the room with the complete tactful invisibility of a 7-year-old trying very hard not to be noticed. "Holen came up to the north fence," Wyatt said. Clara didn't recognize the name. "Who is Holen?" "Rand Holen. He owns the spread east of mine." Wyatt's jaw was set. "He's been pushing the fence line all fall, moving the markers. Nothing I could prove, but I knew." He paused. "Today he came up with 2 of his men while I was checking the upper pasture. Told me the North 40 is his. Says he's got a deed." Clara went still. "Does he?" "He says he does. I haven't seen it." Wyatt's hands were flat on the table. "My deed puts the property line at the ridge. His men put up a new marker while he was talking right in the middle of my pasture, bold as you please, and told me to move my cattle before the end of the week." Clara sat down across from him. "What did you do?" "I pulled the marker out and handed it back to him. And then, he told me I'd regret it." The room was quiet. In the corner, Seth had gone very still over his book. Outside, the wind had come up, and the cabin walls spoke in their familiar, creaking language. "Do you have your original deed?" Clara asked. "In the lockbox. Been there since I filed it in '69. "Can I see it?" Wyatt looked at her. "You know land law." "I know documents," Clara said. "I taught in a frontier town for 5 years. I handled more paperwork for the church, the council, and the schoolhouse than the county clerk did. I know what a legitimate deed looks like, and what a manufactured one looks like, and I know the difference between a registered land claim and a fraudulent resurvey." She paused. "Let me see your deed, Mr. Callahan." He studied her for a moment with that measuring stillness she had come to recognize as his version of serious attention. Then, he got up, went to the locked trunk at the back of the room, and brought back a folded document wrapped in oilskin. She opened it on the table and read it with the same careful focus she gave Caleb's writing exercises, not skimming, not making assumptions, reading the actual words in the actual order they appeared. The deed was dated 1869, registered in Clear Creek County, and described the property boundaries with the specificity of a legitimate survey, distances, compass bearings, natural landmarks named and measured. The registrar's seal was clean and the signature clear. "This is valid," she said. I know it's valid. Then Holen's deed, if he has one, is the problem. A legitimate deed from '69 can't be superseded by a later claim unless there was a registration error, a contested survey, or a filing made in bad faith. She looked up at him. Has anyone tried to challenge your land before? No. Has anything changed in Eagle Ridge recently? New money, new buyers, new interests in the mining territory. He was quiet for a moment. There's been talk of a rail spur coming up through the valley from Denver. The route isn't set yet. He paused. The North 40 sits directly on the most likely path. Clara looked at the deed in her hands and then back at him. Then Holen isn't after your pasture, she said. He's after the right-of-way. The word landed in the room with the particular clarity of a thing that explains everything at once. She watched Wyatt's face absorb it, not surprise exactly more the particular expression of a man who has had a suspicion confirmed and does not find the confirmation satisfying. He filed a manufactured deed, she said, or had someone file it for him. The question is where and when and whether the county registrar noticed the conflict. She set the deed down. You need to get to the county records office before Holen does. If he files an official challenge first, the burden of proof shifts to you, and that costs time and money. She paused. How long to Eagle Ridge? Half a day in good weather. When's the next window? He looked at the ceiling at whatever internal meteorological almanac he kept up there. 2 days, maybe 3. Then we have 2 days, she said, to document every landmark on your property line that matches this deed in writing with measurements so that when you walk into the county office, you have more than a piece of paper, you have evidence. She tapped the deed. I'll write up the comparison document tonight. You tell me the landmarks, I'll match them against the deed language, and we'll find exactly where Holen's claim would have to have been manufactured. She looked up at him. All right. Wyatt had not moved since she started talking. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, and she couldn't quite classify it. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't surprise, though it was closer to surprise than anything else she could name. It was the look she thought of a man encountering something he had not accounted for. All right, he said. They worked at the table until the fire needed banking. Wyatt describing the property in the careful, precise language of a man who had walked every foot of it and loved it, in the practical way that mountain men loved land. Not sentimentally, but with the specific knowledge of a person who had pulled his survival out of it for years. Clara wrote it down in her clearest hand, cross-referencing every landmark against the deed language, noting where they matched exactly, and noting one place where the deed used a creek name that Wyatt said had changed the old name, the settler name before it got remapped in '71. That's useful, she said. Why? Because Holen's manufactured deed, if it's recent, would use the new name. If it uses the old name, someone copied your deed. If it uses the new name, someone made it up from the county maps, which means they have a different error. The creek course shifted in the '71 flood, and the new name refers to the post-flood course, which puts the line 300 feet east of where Holen's markers are. She looked up. Either way, it's wrong. We just need to know which kind of wrong it is. Caleb had come in from the barn sometime in the middle of all this, and was sitting at the far end of the table with a look of focused attention that he was making minimal effort to disguise as something else. When Clara said the last sentence, he said without any pretense of not having been listening, so Holen cheated. Almost certainly, Clara said, and you can prove it. We can prove it, she said, because Wyatt had given her the information, and Wyatt's deed had given her the foundation, and proving it would require both. When your father goes to Eagle Ridge. Caleb looked at his father. Wyatt looked at Clara. And then something happened that was small in itself and enormous in what it meant. Caleb looked at Clara with the specific expression that a child saves for adults who have proven they can be trusted with real things, and said, "Good." That was the moment she understood that she had passed whatever the final test was. Not the arithmetic, not the salt pork, not Seth's stone, or the snowball fight, or the 11 days of getting up every morning and being present in this cabin that hadn't asked for her. It was this sitting at a table at 10 at night with a deed and a written comparison document doing the thing that she specifically knew how to do. Being useful in a way that the mountain and the boys and the man across the table actually needed. And Caleb, who had told her the first night that she wasn't anything, looking at her and saying good. She kept her face still and looked back down at her document and made a small correction to the third line. But her heart was doing something complicated and warm inside her chest, and she let it because she was alone with it in the practical, visible sense, and some things deserve to be felt. Wyatt left for Eagle Ridge at first light 2 days later when the weather opened exactly as he'd predicted. He was gone before the boys were up. Clara had the document rolled in oilskin in his coat pocket before he mounted along with a separate sheet of written instructions, who to speak to at the county registrar's office, what to ask for, what specific language to use when requesting a comparison search on overlapping claims. He looked at the instructions. He looked at her. "The registrar's name is Aldous Mercer," she said. "If he's not there, ask for his deputy. Don't speak to anyone from the land office about the Holland name until you're in front of Mercer directly. And—" She stopped. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't fully classify. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I'll be back by dark." "I know you will," she said. He rode down the mountain, and she stood in the yard and watched him go, and did not move until the tree line swallowed him, and then turned around and went back into the cabin to teach arithmetic to his sons. The day was the longest she had spent on the mountain. Not because she was idle. There was always something to do, and she was not a woman who tolerated idleness well. But because the particular quality of waiting for news about something that mattered had a way of making every ordinary action feel provisional, like a book held open at a page you can't yet turn. She taught Caleb his best writing exercise, yet he was working on persuasive argument because she had discovered that his instinct for stubbornness, translated properly, directed into a formidable ability to build a case and defend it, and she had told him so plainly, and the look on his face when she said it was one she would not forget. She worked with Seth on his reading the river story they'd been working toward for weeks, and when he finally read a full paragraph without stopping, she looked at him over the book and said, "There it is." And he lit up from the inside like something had finally caught fire. In the afternoon, she baked cornbread with the last of the good meal and reorganized the larder because knowing where the food was had become, in the weeks she'd been here, a matter of genuine importance. The difference between a meal that worked and a meal that didn't on a mountain in November was often a matter of whether you could find things in the dark. She reorganized it by frequency of use and labeled the unlabeled tins in her clear schoolteacher's hand and stood back and felt the quiet satisfaction of order imposed on chaos. The boys did their chores. She heard them in the barn. Caleb instructing Seth on something involving the mare's near foreleg, which apparently had some swelling Wyatt had been monitoring. The instruction was patient and thorough in a way that sounded, she thought, exactly like his father. Wyatt rode back in as the sun was going behind the peaks. She heard the horse and was at the door before he'd dismounted, which she was aware was more movement than was strictly dignified, but made no effort to check. He came in, took off his coat, hung it on the peg. His face told her nothing, which she had learned could mean anything. "Well," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, new paper, official letterhead. Set it on the table. "Mercer found Holland's deed," he said. "Filed 6 weeks ago, backdated to 68. He paused. "Mercer says it's the third manufactured claim he's seen in Clear Creek County this year, all 3 in the path of the rail spur survey." Clara picked up the document. It was a formal registration conflict notice signed by Mercer, recording the disputed claim and attaching a preliminary finding of irregularity. "He filed the notice himself," she said. "Your instructions said to ask for a comparison search on overlapping claims. When Mercer ran it, the conflict came up automatically. He'd already had a complaint from another rancher east of here about the same kind of thing. When I showed him your comparison document—" Wyatt stopped. Something moved across his face. "He said whoever wrote that comparison knew what they were doing." Clara set the document down. "What happens now?" "Now it goes to the county judge. Holen's claim gets frozen pending investigation. My deed holds until a hearing." He paused. "Mercer says with the documentation we brought, the hearing should be a formality." The room exhaled. She hadn't realized how much pressure had been sitting in the air of the cabin since Wyatt had come in from the north fence with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table, and she felt it release now, like the first drop of temperature after a fever breaks. Caleb, who had been standing in the doorway from the moment he heard the horse, walked in and picked up the registration document and looked at it with the focused attention of a boy who was, she thought, going to be a formidable man. "It's over?" he asked. "The land part is," Wyatt said. "And Holen?" "That's for the judge." He looked at his son steadily. "We did it right, Caleb. That's all we can do." Caleb looked at the document for another moment. Then he set it down and looked at Clara. And the thing that happened next was so small and so irreversible that she felt it the way you feel a door closing behind you, not with a bang, but with the soft, definitive click of a latch finding its catch. He looked at her and he said, "Thank you. Not for the document, not for the comparison or the instructions or the legal knowledge." The words were simple and they were complete, and they carried the weight of 26 days of resistance finally put down, and she received them as exactly what they were. "You're welcome, Caleb," she said. Seth was at her elbow, she realized. She hadn't heard him come in. He was looking up at her with his hand open at his side, the way he stood when he wanted contact but wasn't going to ask for it. Without thinking, without examining it, she put her hand over his. His fingers closed around two of hers. She looked up and found Wyatt watching. He looked at his son's hand in hers, and then at her face, and then away out the window toward the dark where the mountain was. His expression was contained as it always was, but the containment had a different quality than usual, not the blankness of a man who feels nothing but the particular stillness of a man who feels something and does not yet know what to do with it. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it, and she did not think he was either, and there was wisdom she had always believed in, letting things be what they are before demanding they become something else. She turned to the fire. "Supper," she said. And the cabin, which had held its breath for 3 days, began again to breathe. The hearing notice arrived on a Tuesday tucked inside a packet of supplies that the Eagle Ridge postal rider brought up the mountain trail twice a month when the weather permitted. Wyatt read it standing at the door, still in his coat, and handed it to Clara without comment. She read it at the table. The hearing was set for the second Friday of December, 6 days out in the Clear Creek County Courthouse. Both parties required to appear. Registered deed holders to bring all supporting documentation. Judge Harlan Coe presiding. 6 days, she said. "I know. That's enough time." She set the notice down. "I'll prepare a summary document for the judge. Everything in one place, your deed. The survey landmarks the creek name discrepancy, the comparison to Holen's filing date, and the fact that Mercer's already flagged 2 other manufactured claims on the same rail spur corridor." She paused. "If Holen's attorney tries to complicate it, the corridor pattern is what collapses his case. A single manufactured deed is a dispute. 3 manufactured deeds on the same projected rail route is a conspiracy, and judges in this territory do not like conspiracies." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before." "I've read enough land filings and county records to know how they work," she said. "Eagle Ridge had 3 property disputes in 5 years. The council always asked me to review the documents because the town clerk had bad eyesight and worse handwriting." She picked up her pen. "Sit down and tell me everything Holen said at the fence line. Every word you remember." He sat. He told her. She wrote. Caleb came in from the barn halfway through and sat at the far end of the table without being invited, listening with the same focused silence he brought to his best lessons. When Wyatt finished, Caleb said, "He said you'd regret it. When you pulled the marker out." "He did," Wyatt confirmed. "That's a threat," Caleb said. "Can that go in the document?" Clara looked at him. "It can go in the document," she said. "Good thinking." Caleb absorbed this without expression, but she saw his shoulders change, a small, almost invisible, lifting the physical equivalent of a person standing a little straighter because they have been taken seriously. She added the threat to the document in her clearest hand and moved to the next section. They worked for 2 hours. When the summary was done, she read it back aloud from the beginning, the way she had always read student work back to them, not to perform it, but to hear it, because the ear catches errors, the eye misses. Wyatt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "It's good. It's thorough," she said, which was different and more important. The judge will see everything he needs without having to ask questions. Questions lose time and give opposing counsel room to redirect. "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a county assessor in Ohio," she said. "He believed that a document that required explanation had already failed." She set the papers in order and rolled them in fresh oilskin. "We leave at first light Thursday. That gives us a full day's margin if the weather turns." Wyatt nodded. He did not ask about the boys because she had already factored the boys into the calculation. She had been factoring the boys into every calculation for nearly a month, and he had come to understand this, the way he'd come to understand all the other things she did without being asked, which was by finding them already done when he went looking for them. "The boys'll need," he started. "I'll speak to Mrs. Alderman at the Callahan Creek settlement," Clara said. "She said when I met her at the supply exchange that her door was open if I ever needed help with the boys. I'll send Caleb down tomorrow with a note." He stopped. "You met Eleanor Alderman 3 weeks ago, when you sent me with Caleb to the supply exchange while you were fixing the roof." She looked at him. "She's a good woman. She has 4 boys of her own. Caleb and Seth will be fine for 2 nights. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued by now as his version of being struck by something very still, a slight change in the set of his jaw eyes that were taking in more than usual. "You think of everything," he said. It was not a compliment exactly, it was more like an accounting. "I think of what needs thinking about," she said. "Someone has to." The 2 days before the hearing moved fast and hard. Clara drafted and redrafted the summary document, cross-referencing twice, checking the surveyor's measurements against the deed language with the systematic attention she'd always given to things that mattered and could not afford to be wrong. Caleb delivered her note to Mrs. Alderman and came back with a verbal yes and a jar of apple preserves that Mrs. Alderman had sent as what Caleb described with some bewilderment as a courtesy. "She said to tell you she's glad you're up here," Caleb reported. "She said the mountain needed a woman with sense." Clara accepted the preserves and said nothing, but she felt the words settle somewhere warm. The night before they left, she came down from the loft after the boys were asleep and found Wyatt still at the table, not with his accounts book, but just sitting, hands around his coffee cup, looking at nothing in particular. She had learned by now to read his stillnesses the way she read his face. This one had weight to it, the quality of a man turning something over that wouldn't resolve. She sat across from him. She did not ask what he was thinking, because she'd found that asking Wyatt Callahan what he was thinking produced the same result as asking the mountain. A long silence followed by something that may or may not have been an answer. After a while he said, "What happens if the judge rules against us?" "He won't," she said. "But if he does?" She looked at him. "Then we appeal to the district court, and the documents go with us, and the pattern of manufactured claims goes with us, and the fact that Mercer already flagged the irregularity goes with us." She paused. "Holland can't win this, Wyatt. Not with what he filed. He thought you'd be alone up here, with no one who could read a deed well enough to find the error, and he was wrong." It was the first time she had used his given name. She hadn't planned it. It came out the way things come out when you've been living alongside someone long enough that the formal address starts to feel like a pretense, because she was sitting across a table from him in the middle of the night, before a courthouse hearing defending his land and his son's inheritance, and calling him Mr. Callahan under those circumstances was a fiction neither of them needed. He looked at her when she said it. She did not take it back. "No," he said quietly. He was wrong. They left at first light. The boys were dropped at the Alderman settlement without significant drama. Seth clung to Clara's coat for a moment at parting, and she held his face in her hands and looked at him directly and said, "We'll be back in 2 days. You'll be all right." And he believed her, which was its own kind of enormous thing, and let go. Caleb shook his father's hand with the gravity of a boy practicing being a man and told Clara to win with the absolute confidence of someone who has no doubt that she will. She told him she intended to. The ride down was hard and cold, and she did not complain about it once. Wyatt set the pace and she kept it, which she knew he noticed because at the 2-hour mark, he looked back at her with something that might on another face have been called approval. She looked straight ahead and pretended she hadn't seen it, because she was not performing endurance for his benefit. She was simply enduring the way she'd been enduring things her entire life. And she didn't need it, remarked on. Eagle Ridge in December was grayer and smaller than she remembered it. She had been gone 6 weeks, and the town had contracted in her absence into something she didn't recognize as the place that had consumed 5 years of her life. The boarding house where Mrs. Holt had given her that particular smile. The courthouse steps where she had pressed her palms flat and not cried. The lot where the schoolhouse ash had been cleared and something else was already being built. She rode past all of it with her back straight and her eyes forward. They stayed at the only hotel's separate rooms which Wyatt arranged with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to everything. And she went to bed early and slept without difficulty, because she had learned in 6 weeks on a mountain that sleep was a resource and wasting it on anxiety was an expense she couldn't afford. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. Judge Harlan Coe was a small, dry-faced man in his 60s who gave the impression of a person who had heard every argument that existed and retained opinions on none of them, which Clara assessed correctly, she thought, as the ideal kind of judge for a document case. He did not want drama. He wanted evidence. She had brought him evidence. Holland arrived with an attorney from Denver, a smooth-coated man named Fitch, who had the manner of someone accustomed to winning by complication, by generating so much paperwork and procedural motion that the other party either ran out of money or ran out of patience. He looked at Clara when she came in and visibly recalibrated, which she noted and set aside. The hearing opened with Fitch presenting Holland's claim, a manufactured document with backdated signatures and a surveyor's seal that Clara had already identified in her summary as belonging to a surveyor who had died in 1872, years before the document's claimed survey date. She had found this in the county death records, which Mercer had pulled for her on Wyatt's first visit and which she had included as an appendix. When Fitch finished, Judge Coe looked at Wyatt. Response. Wyatt looked at Clara. She stood. Fitch's eyes sharpened. Your Honor, this woman is not an attorney of record. She's my advisor, Wyatt said. I'm entitled to an advisor. In my courtroom, Judge Coe said, without looking up from his papers. A man is entitled to whoever he brings with him. Proceed, ma'am. Clara set the summary document on the table. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes because she had written the document and knew it from the inside. She walked the judge through the deed timeline, the survey landmarks, the creek name discrepancy, the dead surveyor's seal, and then deliberately last because she had learned from her father that you end with the thing you want the judge to be still thinking about when he makes his ruling the pattern. 3 manufactured claims. Same county. Same 6-week filing window. All 3 in the projected path of the Denver Rail Spur Survey, which the Territorial Railroad Office had filed as a preliminary route in September. This is not a boundary dispute, she said, setting the last document in front of the judge, the Railroad Office filing obtained by Mercer from the Territorial Records in Denver, which had arrived by courier the day before Wyatt and Clara had left the mountain. This is a coordinated land fraud. Mr. Holland, or persons acting with him, obtained the projected rail route before it was publicly filed, identified the parcels in the right-of-way, and manufactured backdated deeds to displace the rightful owners before the route announcement drove land values up. She paused. Mr. Callahan's deed is registered continuous and corroborated by 23 years of uncontested occupancy. Mr. Holland's deed was manufactured by a man who, according to county death records, was not alive to conduct the survey it claims. The courtroom was very quiet. Fitch stood. Your Honor, these are extraordinary allegations. They are documented allegations, Clara said, and she said it without raising her voice, because she had never found it necessary to raise her voice to be heard, and she was not going to start now. She looked at Fitch with the particular calm she had developed over 5 years of managing rooms full of children who thought volume was the same as authority. Every claim I have made is supported by a document in that summary. If Mr. Fitch would like to challenge any specific document, I welcome the opportunity to walk through the sourcing. Fitch looked at the summary. He had had it for exactly 7 minutes. He had not read it fully, which she had anticipated, because attorneys who win by complication do not expect to be out-documented. He sat back down. Judge Coe read for 4 minutes in silence. He turned pages with the deliberate pace of a man who reads carefully and does not perform reading for anyone's benefit. When he looked up, he looked at Holen, not at Fitch. "Mr. Holen," he said, "you would like to explain the surveyor's seal." Holen was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had the look of someone accustomed to having his money do his speaking. The money, Clara thought, was having some difficulty with this particular sentence. "My attorney," he started. "I'm asking you," the judge said. A long silence. "I purchased the deed," Holen said. He said it the way a man says something when he has calculated that partial truth is safer than the whole. "I didn't manufacture it. I bought it from a land agent in Denver." "His name," Judge Coe said. Clara watched Holen's face process that question. Watched him understand that giving the name led to the agent, and the agent led to the railroad office leak, and the leak was a federal crime that made land fraud look modest. She watched him arrive at the place where the math simply didn't work in his favor, and there was nothing left to do but cut the line. "Dawson," Holen said. "A man named Dawson." Fitch closed his eyes briefly. Judge Coe looked at his clerk. "Get me the federal land office." He looked back at the room. "This hearing is continued pending federal investigation into the coordinated filing scheme. Mr. Callahan's deed is confirmed as primary record. Mr. Holen's claim is suspended." He paused. "Young woman." Clara looked up. "Your documentation is the most complete I have seen in 20 years on this bench," he said. "What is your profession?" "School teacher," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "What a waste," he said, and did not mean it unkindly, and she accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was as high a compliment as a county judge was likely to produce. They were back on the street by noon. Wyatt stood beside his horse and did not say anything for a long moment. She stood beside hers and let the silence be what it was. Around them, Eagle Ridge went about its December business, indifferent as it had always been, and she felt looking at the street that had left her with 2 coins and nothing else. 6 weeks ago, that she was not the same person who had stood on those courthouse steps and pressed her palms flat and promised herself she would not cry. "You didn't need me there at all," Wyatt said. "I needed your deed," she said. "Clara." The name stopped her. He had not used it before they had moved from Miss Bennet to first names only in that direction. Only her saying his and hearing her own name in his voice had a quality she had not prepared for. She looked at him. "You saved it," he said. "The land, the boy's land." He paused, and the pause had the particular weight of a man who knows words are insufficient and uses them anyway because they are what he has. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "You don't need to," she said. "I want to," he said. She looked at him across the cold space between their horses, this large and contained and difficult man, who spoke in 12 words when other men used 50 and meant every one of them, and she thought about the contract in her book crate, and the rope ladder, and Seth's stone in her dress pocket, and Caleb's paper folded in his shirt, and the way the cabin had felt on the first night, like a place she did not belong, and felt now like a place she could not imagine leaving. And she thought about what she had told herself in the loft on the first night. "You have survived everything so far." "Then thank me properly," she said, "by taking me back up that mountain." Something shifted in his face, that almost expression, the one that was close to a smile and consistently declined to become one. "That," he said, "I can do." They rode out of Eagle Ridge before the afternoon light changed back up the trail that had felt like exile 6 weeks ago, and felt now like direction, like intention, like the particular pull of a place that has learned your name. The mountain came toward them as they climbed, dark and enormous and cold and entirely indifferent in the way that only the things you love can afford to be. She rode beside him on the widest sections of the trail, not behind, because she was not a woman who rode behind, and he had stopped positioning himself ahead of her 3 weeks ago without either of them remarking on it. They were 2 hours out of Eagle Ridge when the light began to go and the temperature began to drop in the sharp way that meant the night would be hard, and she heard him say beside her, "You cold?" "Not particularly," she said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a wool scarf she recognized as his, and held it out without comment. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, holding the scarf sideways, with the patience of a man who has decided to do something and is not going to be talked out of it. She took it, wound it around her neck. It smelled of wood smoke and cold air and was warm in the immediate practical way of something that had already done the work of holding someone else's warmth. She did not thank him. It seemed unnecessary in the way that most things had started to seem unnecessary between them. All the formal scaffolding of two people who were still pretending to be strangers, all the careful maintaining of distance in a space that had been for weeks less and less distant. They rode the last 2 hours in the familiar silence, and the silence was not empty. They picked up the boys from the Alderman settlement, where Seth launched himself at Clara with the contained urgency of a 7-year-old who has been dignified about a departure for 2 days and has now run out of dignity. She caught him and held him for a moment without speaking, her hand at the back of his head, and he pressed his face into her shoulder and let out one long, slow breath, and that was all. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch and watched this. He looked at his father. "Did she win?" he asked. "She won," Wyatt said. Caleb looked at Clara over his brother's head. "I knew she would," he said. It was not directed at anyone in particular. It was simply a fact being released into the air the way you release something you've been holding because you no longer need to hold it. They were back in the cabin by dark. The fire needed building up, and there was supper to make, and the boys needed washing. Mrs. Alderman had fed them well, but the concept of soap had apparently been considered optional, and the animals needed checking after 2 days, with only the Alderman's eldest boy looking in on them. It was the full, ordinary machinery of the household, all of it waiting, and Clara moved through it without pausing, building the fire and putting water on, and checking the larder, and the boys moved with her, the way they had learned to move, each occupying his part of the work without being told. Wyatt came in from the barn and stood in the doorway watching the three of them move through the cabin in the particular choreography of people who have learned each other's rhythms. And Clara looked up from the fire and saw him standing there with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had not seen before in all the weeks she had been here. It was not the still measuring expression. It was not the flat practicality. It was something unguarded, something that had gotten out from behind whatever internal discipline he normally kept it behind, and it was looking at her, and at his sons, and at the fire, and at the cabin, as if seeing all of it at once and finding it. She did not trust herself to name what he was finding it. She looked back at the fire, but she felt it against her skin like warmth, like a second fire, and she did not move away from it. After supper, after the boys were in their beds, Wyatt did not open his accounts book. He sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and neither of them reached for anything to occupy their hands, which was unusual enough that she was aware of it. The space between them had changed quality again. It did this, she had noticed, in increments, each increment so small that you couldn't point to the moment it happened, only to the accumulation. He said, "What will you do in spring?" The question landed with a weight she hadn't expected. "What do you mean?" "The contract," he said. "You can leave in spring. The weather opens up, the trail's clear. You could go back to Eagle Ridge or somewhere else." He paused. "You'd have better options than you did in November. What you did in that courthouse today, there are law offices in Denver that would hire you." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to leave in spring." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. It came out flat and plain, and entirely unadorned the way everything he said came out, but it carried everything in it that he hadn't said, which was considerable. "No, it's not what I want." He looked up. I want you to know that you have the choice, that you're not here because you had nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else to go now. You earned it today. He paused. I want you to stay because you choose to stay, not because the mountain has you trapped. Clara looked at this man across the table, a man who had offered her a contract on a frozen street because it was the most honest thing he knew how to do, who had signed her terms without argument, who had shown her his land and taught her the wind, and stood in the courtroom doorway while she dismantled a fraud because he understood that it was her work to do, who was now in the clumsiest and most straightforward and most genuine way she had ever been spoken to by anyone, telling her that he wanted her to stay and that she was free to go. She thought about the stone in her pocket. She thought about Caleb's 8 on the writing exercise. She thought about the scarf still wound around her neck that smelled of wood smoke. She thought about the loft on the first night, pressing her palms flat and telling herself she had survived everything so far. I'm not trapped, she said. I haven't been trapped in quite some time. She looked at him directly. Ask me properly. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not relief, but something that lived in the territory between them, something large and careful. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, because she had learned to let him find his way to the thing he was reaching for. Stay, he said. Not for the contract, not for the boys, though they need you. He paused. For yourself, because this is yours now if you want it. He looked at his hands on the table, and then back at her. Because I want it to be yours. The fire breathed. The mountain pressed around the cabin. Somewhere in the dark, an owl moved through the pines and did not call out. Clara said, I'll stay. He nodded, looked back at the table. Put his hand on it. Open, palm up, not reaching for her, not demanding anything, simply placing it there, the way you place something you are offering, and leaving the taking to the other person. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, large and rough and warm and steady, exactly as they had been the first night when he'd helped her down from the horse outside this cabin, and she had stepped into the snow and looked at 2 boys in a doorway and told herself she had survived everything so far. She had, and she was still here, and the cabin, which had held its breath for 37 days, let it out all at once. Outside, the mountain went on being enormous and cold and indifferent. Inside, the fire held against the dark, and it was warm, and it was enough, and it was hers. His hand was still warm when she woke the next morning. Not literally. He had gone to his side of the cabin long before she climbed the rope ladder, and the night had passed in the ordinary way of nights on the mountain, cold and long and full of wind. But she woke with the warmth of it still present in some way. She couldn't explain the way certain moments leave a physical residue that your body holds on to, even after your mind has moved on to the practical business of mourning. She lay still for a moment in the loft and listened to the cabin below the fire already going, which meant Wyatt had been up before her, which was the only constant she had known from the first day, and then she got up and climbed down and started the coffee. He was at the table with his accounts book when she came down, but he looked up when she appeared, which he had not always done in the early weeks. He looked up, and something in his face acknowledged the previous evening, without naming it, the way 2 people acknowledge a thing they have agreed to carry forward without ceremony. She set his coffee in front of him. He said, "Thank you, Clara." The name again. Still new in his mouth, still carrying the particular weight of a thing that has been held back and is now permitted. She sat across from him with her own cup, and they drank in the morning quiet, and did not need to fill it, and the cabin felt in a way it had been approaching for weeks, and had now arrived at entirely like itself. The boys came down in the way they always came down. Caleb first, dropping the last 2 rungs, Seth careful and deliberate behind him, and they ate breakfast and did their chores, and the day opened up in the patterned way that days on the mountain did, one task following the next with the clean logic of survival. But something in the texture of it had changed, and all 4 of them felt it, without speaking it, the way a room feels different after a window has been opened, even if the window is now closed again. December deepened. The snow came in earnest, the real winter that the mountains kept in reserve, until it was ready to make its full argument, and the cabin became the world in the way it does when the world outside becomes impassable. Clara had thought in the first week that this kind of confinement would be its own kind of trial. 4 people, and a small space, and no relief. She had been wrong. The confinement produced a different thing entirely. It produced intimacy of the unremarkable kind, the kind that comes not from grand gestures, but from washing dishes alongside someone for the 40th time, from knowing exactly how a person takes their coffee and what specific sound they make when they are about to say something they've been thinking about for a while. She learned all of Wyatt Callahan in December. Not the surface things, those she had learned in November, the flat speech and the economy of motion, and the way his jaw set when he was worried. She learned the interior things. She learned that he read slowly and with complete absorption when he had a book in his hands, which was rare, because books had not been a priority in his supply runs, and he was faintly embarrassed about the slowness, though he need not have been. She lent him one of hers, not a primer, not an arithmetic text, but a novel, one of the battered ones from the bottom of her crate that she had carried from Ohio through teaching certificates and boarding houses and 5 years in Eagle Ridge, and she watched him read it at the table in the evenings with the same focused attention he gave to his accounts, and she did not tell him he was moving his lips slightly, because it was not her business, and it was, she thought, one of the most genuine things she had ever seen a person do. She learned that he had built the cabin himself in the winter of '68 alone, which accounted for its particular character. Solid where it needed to be solid, spare everywhere else. No decoration, no concession to comfort, except a single shelf above the fireplace that held 3 objects. A small tintype photograph, a child's carved wooden horse, and a woman's thimble. She did not ask about these. But she saw him look at the shelf sometimes in the evenings, a brief contained look that acknowledged something and moved on. And she understood that grief was not a place you left, but a place you learned to live alongside, and that he had been doing this longer than she had known him, and would be doing it long after the winter ended. She learned that Seth, given sufficient encouragement and the river story she had promised him, was a reader of startling depth, not fast, but thorough, the kind of reader who went back to sentences and held them, who asked questions days after he'd read something, because he'd still been thinking about it. She discovered this on the afternoon she found him at the table with Huckleberry Finn open in front of him, not at the page she'd assigned, but 30 pages ahead, and when she said his name, he looked up with the particular expression of someone surfacing from deep water. "I had to know what happened," he said with the complete simplicity of a boy who has not yet learned to be embarrassed about caring. "And what did?" she asked. He told her. For 6 minutes without stopping, with genuine feeling about the characters and what they had done and whether it was right, and she sat across from him and listened to this 7-year-old boy who had not spoken more than 4 consecutive sentences in the first 2 weeks she'd known him, and she thought, this is the thing that lasts. Not the deed, not the hearing, not the contract in the book crate. This. A child finding out that stories hold still while everything else moves. "You can read ahead," she told him when he'd finished. He looked at the book, then at her. "Always, always," she said. He nodded and went back to his page with the solemnity of a person who has been given something real and knows it. It was Caleb who brought the crisis, which was not a surprise because Caleb had been the source of every significant turning point in the cabin's interior life since Clara arrived, not out of malice, but out of the particular intensity of a boy who felt everything at full volume, and had only recently begun to learn that this was not a character flaw. It was the middle of December, 17 days after the courthouse hearing, 11 days into the deep winter. Caleb and Seth had been sent out to split the afternoon's wood from the covered pile, a task that Caleb performed with the focused efficiency of a boy who was good with his hands and knew it. Clara was inside at the fire working through a difficult arithmetic problem she'd set herself, because she found that keeping her own mind sharp made her a better teacher. Wyatt was in the upper barn, repairing the roof section that had shifted under the snow load 2 nights before. She heard the sound before she understood it. It came through the cabin walls, not a shout, not a cry, but a particular quality of silence that followed a sound. the silence that falls when something has gone wrong and the person it happened to has not yet caught enough breath to make noise. She was at the door before she had decided to move. Caleb was on the ground outside. The axe was beside him. His left forearm was pressed against his chest, and his face had gone the color of new paper, and he was looking at his arm with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and not entirely succeeding. Seth was standing 3 feet away, frozen, staring. "Seth," Clara said, her voice coming out clear and steady in the way that voices do when the body decides that steadiness is the only option available. "Go get your father. Run." Seth ran. She crossed the yard to Caleb. She dropped to her knees beside him without hesitation and looked at his arm. The axe had slipped on a frozen log and caught him on the forearm, a deep gash wide and clean, already bleeding freely through the sleeve of his coat. She could not see the depth yet. She needed to see the depth. "Let me see it," she said. "It's fine," Caleb said, which was so entirely untrue that she did not address it. "Caleb, let me see it." He moved his right hand away from the wound. She pushed the coat sleeve up. The gash was deep, deeper than she wanted it to be, deep enough that the edges were not holding together deep enough that it was not going to close on its own. She pressed the sleeve back over it with firm direct pressure and took his right hand and put it on top. "Keep pressing, hard, don't let go." "How bad is it?" he asked. He was working very hard to sound like his father. "Bad enough to need attention," she said. "Not bad enough to be catastrophic if we move fast." She looked at his face. "Are you going to be sick?" He considered this seriously. "Maybe." "That's all right. Do it if you need to. It won't change anything." She stood. "Can you walk?" "Yes," he said with more certainty than she'd had from him about anything since she'd arrived. And she thought even then, even in that moment, that it said something about him. She got him inside. She put him on the bench by the fire and went to the larder for the medical kit. She had reorganized it in her first week, labeled everything, moved it to the front of the shelf where she could find it in the dark if she needed to, which she had known from 5 years of teaching children that she might. She pulled the kit, pulled the water pot off the hook and put fresh water on, pulled her sewing kit because the suture needle was in it, and because she had quietly, and without telling anyone, examined the medical kit in week 1 and decided that the suture thread needed replacing and had replaced it from her own thread stock with the heaviest weight she had, the linen thread she used for mending heavy fabric. She had not told Wyatt she had done this. She had simply done it because it needed doing, because the mountain required preparation, and because a woman who had reorganized the larder and read the deed language and written the comparison document for the county judge was not going to leave a medical kit in disorder and call it someone else's problem. She laid everything on the table and looked at Caleb, who was watching her with his arm pressed against his chest and his jaw set in the particular way that was entirely his father's. "I need to clean it," she said. "And then I need to close it. The cleaning will hurt more than the closing, which is the opposite of what you'd expect, so be ready for that." He swallowed. "Have you done this before?" "My father cut his hand badly on a scythe when I was 14, she said. "My mother had gone to town. He couldn't do it himself, and I was the only one there." She poured boiled water over the clean cloth and wrung it out without rushing. "So yes." "Did it work?" "He still has the hand," she said. "Hold still." She cleaned the wound. He made one sound, brief and bitten off and honest, and then set his teeth and held still, which she had not been certain he would manage, and was glad he did, because it made the work easier. The gash was deep but clean, which was the best outcome available, and the bleeding with pressure was already slowing. She could see the edges clearly. 6 stitches, she estimated. Maybe 7. "I'm going to close it now," she said. "This part is strange more than painful. You'll feel the pull, but if I do it right, it shouldn't be much worse than that." "Do it right then," he said. She did. She worked with the same focused calm. She brought to the writing corrections and the deed documents and everything else that required precision and could not afford error. 6 stitches, each one placed with care, the thread pulled to close without tearing. Caleb breathed through it in long, controlled breaths that she recognized as deliberate, as practiced as the breathing of a boy who had been in pain before, and had learned to manage it, which broke her heart a little, even as she kept working. She was tying the final knot when Wyatt came through the door. He took in the scene in one look: Caleb on the bench, Clara kneeling in front of him, the blood-soaked cloth on the floor beside her, the medical kit open on the table. His face went very still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. A whitening around the jaw that was fear, expressed as control, as absolute discipline, refusing to allow the fear to be useful. "He's all right," Clara said before he could cross the room. 6 stitches. The axe slipped on ice. It's deep, but it missed everything important. She tied off the last knot and straightened, and looked at Wyatt across Caleb's head. He held very still. He did well. Wyatt looked at his son. Caleb looked back at his father, and said with the careful dignity of a 10-year-old who has just been stitched up without crying, "I'm all right, Pa." Wyatt crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hand on the back of Caleb's head just briefly, just once, the kind of touch that says everything that can't be said. Caleb leaned into it for exactly 1 second, and then straightened because he was 10, and there were limits to what he was going to allow. Seth was standing in the doorway, still white-faced, watching. Clara looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "Close the door." He came. He sat beside his brother on the bench without being told, and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's, and said nothing, which was what Seth did when words were insufficient, and it was as it always was enough. Wyatt turned to Clara. She was wrapping the wound in clean cloth, tying it off her hands, still doing the work. He looked at her hands. They were steady, not the forced steadiness of someone controlling fear, but the genuine steadiness of someone who had been present to the thing that needed doing and had done it. He looked at her face. She was already moving, cleaning the instruments, clearing the blood-soaked cloth, putting the medical kit back in order with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything, acting as if what had just happened was a thing that had been handled, which it had, because she had handled it. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had no words for it. She could see that plainly, could see him reaching for something and finding the space where the words should be empty, because there were no words in his particular vocabulary for what he was looking at, which was a woman who had taken the most frightening thing that could happen on this mountain in winter and simply met it with her hands and her training and her absolute refusal to be anything less than what the moment required. He crossed to her. He took her hands, both of them still wrapped around the cloth she was folding, and held them, and she felt the warmth of his grip and did not pull away, and they stood like that for a moment in the middle of the cabin, with his sons watching from the bench and the fire breathing behind them, and the mountain doing what it always did, which was nothing at all, because the mountain did not care, but the people inside the cabin did, and that was the whole of it. "Thank you," he said. Not the way he'd said it before. Not the way anyone had said it to her before in all the years she'd spent being useful and capable and giving people things they needed, and being thanked with the particular politeness of people who have forgotten that gratitude is supposed to have weight. This had weight. This had everything. "He's your son," she said simply. "I wasn't going to let anything happen to him." She felt his grip tighten briefly and then release, and she went back to the medical kit, and he went to Caleb and checked the binding with his own hands, running his fingers over the knot she'd tied, and she could tell from the quality of his silence that he approved of it, which she already knew because she had tied it right. That evening was different from every other evening the cabin had produced. Not louder it was, if anything quieter. But the quiet had a fullness to it, a saturation, the quality of a space that has been through something real together and come out the other side still intact. Caleb ate supper with his left arm held carefully against his side, and Seth cut his brother's meat without being asked, which made Caleb look at him with an expression of mixed irritation and gratitude that resolved finally into simple acceptance. Wyatt refilled Clara's coffee, without being asked, which was something she would have noticed in any other week and noted as significant. Tonight, it was simply part of the movement of the evening, as ordinary as the fire. After supper, after the boys were in their beds, Wyatt went to the shelf above the fireplace. She had wondered about those 3 objects since the first week. She had seen him look at them, had understood they were not decorative, but were instead functional in the way that grief objects are functional. They hold a weight so you don't have to hold all of it in your body. She had never asked. She watched him now as he stood at the shelf and reached up and took something down. He brought it to the table and set it in front of her. It was the small, carved wooden horse. She could see close up that it was more carefully made than it had appeared from across the room. The lines of it deliberate. The grain of the wood followed rather than cut against. It was not sophisticated work, but it was real work. The work of someone who understood the material and had spent time with it. "I made that the first winter," he said. "Before Caleb was born. I didn't know what we were having, and I wanted to have something ready either way." He paused. "Ruth, their mother, she always said it was the best thing I ever made." He looked at it. "I've been working on something else," he said, "for the past few weeks." He reached into his coat pocket and put something else on the table. It was a bird, carved from the same pale mountain wood, small enough to sit in a palm with wings lifted, as if it had just decided to take flight or had just landed. She couldn't tell which, and she thought that was intentional, that the ambiguity was part of it. The work was finer than the horse. He had taken more care, or he had gotten better, or both. The feathers were suggested rather than detailed, which was the right choice, which showed an eye that understood the difference between representation and interpretation. She looked at it for a long time. "It's not finished," he said. "The tail needs more work." "Don't touch the tail," she said. He looked at her. "It's right as it is," she said. She looked up at him. "What kind of bird?" "Doesn't have a kind," he said. "It's just a bird that wanted to go somewhere and went." She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected and fit exactly in her hand, which she did not think was an accident. She held it and looked at it and thought about 2 coins and a courthouse and a mountain that had not asked for her, and a cabin that had learned her name. And she thought about what it meant that a man who spoke in 12 words had spent weeks with a knife and a piece of pale mountain wood, making a bird that wanted to go somewhere and went. She laughed. It came out of her without warning or intention, not a polite laugh, not the managed laughter of a schoolteacher maintaining decorum, but a real one, full and sudden and warm, the kind that happens when something hits you in a place you didn't know was waiting to be hit. She laughed and felt the whole long weight of the past 6 weeks move through it and come out the other side, different, lighter, resolved into something she could carry without effort. He watched her laugh. His expression had the quality it got when he was feeling something he wasn't going to name, which by now she could read as clearly as his words, and what it said was that her laughing was the thing he had been working toward in the way that all the other things, the deed, the hearing, the hand on the table, had been working toward something whose name he hadn't been ready to say. She set the bird down on the table between them. "Thank you, Wyatt." "You're welcome, Clara," he said. They sat in the evening quiet, and the fire held against the cold. And outside the mountain went on being vast and indifferent, in the way that only the things that will outlast you can afford to be. She picked up her letter writing, and he picked up his book. Her book, the novel she had lent him, which he was 2/3 through and had not commented on except to say one evening that the main character made poor decisions which she had agreed with, which had led to the longest conversation they had yet had about something entirely unrelated to the cabin or the land or the boys. And she thought now, watching him read, with his lips moving slightly, and his full attention given over to the page, that she would bring more books down from the loft, that she would build a shelf, that the cabin had room for a shelf, that she knew where to put it. She was planning a shelf in a cabin on a mountain that had not asked for her. In the middle of December, in the year of our Lord, 1873, in Clear Creek County, Colorado Territory, with 2 stitched-up boys asleep in the corner, and a large, contained, difficult man reading a novel with his lips moving, and a carved bird sitting on the table between them, that wanted to go somewhere and had gone. She was home. Not the home she had planned for or imagined or worked toward in any deliberate way. Not the home that Ohio or Eagle Ridge or any of the sensible futures she had mapped out for herself would have produced. A home that had been earned in increments in salt pork and arithmetic, and a 7-year-old's best stone and 6 stitches in a 10-year-old's forearm, and a deed defended in a county courthouse, and a hand held open on a table in the dark, waiting to see if she would take it. She had taken it. She was taking it still. She intended to keep taking it every day for as long as the mountain stood, and the cabin held, and the fire burned, and those two boys needed someone who showed up regardless. January came, and with it, a letter from the Federal Land Office in Denver. Wyatt read it at the table and handed it to Clara, and she read it twice because the first time she read it, she thought she had misunderstood the scale of it. She had not misunderstood. Dawson, the land agent named by Holan in the hearing, had been arrested in Denver and had under interrogation named 4 other parties involved in the rail spur scheme, including a county clerk in Clear Creek, a surveyor operating under a dead man's license, a railroad company investor with political connections in the territorial government, and Rand Holan himself, who had apparently been the scheme's local operator rather than its architect. All 5 were facing federal land fraud charges. 3 other affected landowners in the county had already had their properties confirmed and their fraudulent competing deeds voided. At the bottom of the letter, in a separate paragraph, there was a note from the federal examiner, a man named Carroll, who had obtained the summary document from Judge Coe, and had written to ask formally whether the author of the document would be willing to consult on similar cases in the region for appropriate compensation at her convenience. At her convenience. Clara set the letter down. Wyatt was watching her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She thought about it for less time than she would have expected. "Write back and tell him I'm available by correspondence for consultation," she said. "I won't go to Denver. My work is here." She paused. "But if he wants to send documents, I can review them. The compensation would help with the book situation." "The book situation," Wyatt repeated. "I'm going to need more books," she said. "I'm building a shelf." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll build you a shelf," he said. "I know where I want it," she said. "West wall between the window and the fireplace, 3 levels, the bottom one low enough for Seth to reach." He nodded. "I'll start tomorrow." She picked up her pen and began drafting the reply to Carol. She wrote it in the same clear, direct language she used for everything that mattered. Because it did matter. It mattered that the work she had done in that courthouse had undone something that would have hurt 3 families who were not as fortunate as Wyatt, who had not had someone at that table in November who knew how to read a deed, and if her particular ability could prevent that from happening to someone else, then she was going to use it. She was a school teacher on a mountain in Colorado. She was also apparently someone whom federal examiners wrote to at her convenience. She was also the woman who had stitched up Caleb Callahan's arm and received Seth Callahan's best stone and held Wyatt Callahan's hand in the dark and was planning the location of a bookshelf on the west wall. She was all of these things simultaneously, and she found she did not need to choose between them. Caleb's arm healed clean. She removed the stitches on the 10th day, which he bore with the stoic impatience of a boy who considers healing to be taking longer than necessary, and she inspected the closed wound with the care she'd given to the initial work, and found it exactly as it should be, a clean line of new skin already beginning to fade. She pressed the area gently to check the tissue beneath, and he did not flinch, which meant the depth had closed properly, which meant she had done it right from the beginning. "Good as it's going to be," she said. He looked at the scar already white against the tan of his forearm already settled into permanence. "Will it always look like that?" "Yes," she said. He ran his thumb along it. "It looks like something a person earned," he said with the particular satisfaction of a 10-year-old who has decided that a scar is an asset. "It does," she agreed. He put his sleeve down. Started to get up. Then he stopped, which was so unlike him. He never stopped when he was in motion, never hesitated. It was not in his nature, and she waited because she had learned to wait for him to find his way to things. "I'm glad you're here," he said. He said it to the table, not to her, which was the only way he could have said it, and meant it the way he meant it. "I wasn't, before." He paused. "But I am now." Clara looked at the top of his head, dark hair, his father's hair, and felt something press against the inside of her chest that was not grief and was not joy, but was what you feel when something that has been broken for a long time finally finishes putting itself back together. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said. "I wasn't entirely sure at first." He looked up at that, startled into something like a smile. "You didn't seem unsure." "That," she said, "is the most important thing I have ever taught you." He did smile, then a real one, brief and bright and entirely his own, and got up and went out to the barn, and she sat at the table alone and held the moment for a count of 3 before she let it go, because she had learned on this mountain that the moments worth keeping are the ones you hold briefly and then release, so they stay whole. The shelf went up on the west wall in January, built in 3 days from boards. Wyatt cut himself 3 levels exactly where she'd asked for them. The bottom one at Seth's height, sanded smooth on the edges with a care that she knew was not required by utility, and acknowledged that fact without comment. She lined it with books from the crate. Not all of them, because the crate also lived in the cabin, now supplemented by 2 new volumes that had come up with the supply rider in the January run. And the shelf looked, once it was filled, like something the cabin had always had and had simply been waiting for. Seth stood in front of it for a long time on the morning she filled it. "Can I take one whenever I want?" he asked. "That is what they're there for," she said. He pulled out the river book. He had already read it twice. He put it back and pulled out another one, something she had taught from an Eagle Ridge that she had thought might suit him, and turned it over in his hands and read the back cover with his lips moving, and then looked up at her. "Is this one good?" "I think you'll find it very good," she said. He tucked it under his arm with the careful deliberateness of a boy treating a book like something that deserves ceremony, and went to his corner and was lost to the world within 4 minutes. She turned around and found Wyatt behind her, looking at the shelf. He ran his hand along the top edge, checking the level, which was perfectly true. He had built it true. He knew it was true. He was touching it for a different reason, and she let him. "It suits the room," he said. "It suits the family," she said. He looked at her at that word. She held his gaze. She had meant it exactly. She had not stumbled into it or offered it carelessly. She had meant this family, these 4 specific people in this specific cabin on this specific mountain. And she was not going to take it back or qualify it because it was true. And she had learned in the 43 days since she had come off those courthouse steps with 2 coins and nothing else that the only things worth saying were the ones that were true. "Yes," he said, "it does." March arrived with the first real thaw, tentative and cold, but present. The mountain releasing winter by degrees, the way it did everything slowly, without announcement, without asking permission. The trail to Eagle Ridge became passable on a clear day. Birds came back to the pines. The creek at the lower pasture, which had been locked for 3 months, began to run again in the early afternoons when the sun hit it directly. Seth went down to the creek on the first running day and came back with a stone. He set it on the table in front of Clara, smooth, rounded, pale gray with a single vein of white, almost identical to the one he had given her in November. She looked at it, looked at him. "For Caleb," he said, "since he lost his one in the snow." She picked it up and set it aside to give to Caleb. Then she reached into her dress pocket, which she had worn every day for 4 months, and took out the original stone, his best one given on an ordinary afternoon, because she was worth giving it to, and held it so he could see it. His face did something complicated and warm. "You kept it," he said. "I told you I would keep it safe," she said. He looked at the stone in her hand. Then he looked at her face, and for a moment she saw him clearly, this quiet, deep-feeling, river-reading boy who had decided in November to give her his best thing, and she thought about all the ways a person can be brave, and how the smallest ones are sometimes the ones that cost the most. "Miss Clara," he said. She had told him in the first week to call her Miss Bennett. He had called her Miss Clara for the past 6 weeks, which had happened gradually and without announcement, and which she had not corrected. "Yes," she said. "Are you going to stay forever?" She looked at him. She thought about honest answers, about the impossibility of promising forever on a mountain in Colorado in the 19th century, about weather and illness and the unpredictability of things. She thought about what a 7-year-old actually needed when he asked that question, which was not a philosopher's qualifier, but a person's word. "Yes," she said. He nodded satisfied, in the way of a child whose internal accounting has just been settled, and went to find his brother. She sat at the table with his stone in her hand, and looked at the west wall at the shelf, with its books arranged in the order she had chosen at the cabin that had held 4 people through a winter that had tried everything. It had cold and confinement, and grief and fear, and a 10-year-old's blood, and a land fraud, and 2 long nights waiting for news, and had come out the other side of all of it intact. More than intact. Changed. Irreversibly, completely, permanently changed. That evening, as the last of the March light moved off the mountain and the cabin filled with the familiar warmth of the banked fire and the smell of supper, and the particular sounds of its particular people. Caleb at the table, working on a writing exercise that was going to score a 9, she could already tell because his argument was strong, but his conclusion was still arriving 2 sentences too late. Seth in his corner with his book. Wyatt at the far end of the table with his accounts, his lips moving very slightly over a column of numbers, which was not the same as his lips moving over words in a novel, but was in the same family of genuine effort, and she found she loved them both equally. Clara looked around at all of it. She did not analyze it. She did not qualify it. She did not hold it at arm's length or locate the exit or remind herself that she had once been a woman with a plan and a schoolhouse and a clear idea of what her life was going to look like. She had been all of those things, and then the schoolhouse had burned, and the plan had ended, and she had stood on courthouse steps with 2 coins and pressed her palms flat, and not cried. And then a large, serious, impossible man had crossed a frozen street and offered her a roof. She had taken the roof. She had taken everything that came with the roof, and it had taken everything she had, and it had been worth every single day of it. And she knew, with the clarity of someone who has stopped pretending that certainty is something to be afraid of, that it would go on being worth it. Outside the mountain stood in the dark, as it had always stood, and would always stand, enormous and cold and magnificent, and entirely indifferent to the lives of the people who sheltered in its shadow. It did not care about deeds or hearings, or carved birds, or stitched wounds, or stones given on ordinary afternoons. It did not care about contracts made on frozen streets, or hands held open in the dark, or boys who learned to trust women they had not asked for. But inside the cabin, the fire held, and the shelf held its books. And Seth turned a page, and Caleb crossed out a sentence and wrote it better. And Wyatt looked up from his accounts and across the table at Clara, and the look he gave her was the same look he had given her the night she said she would stay unguarded, uncontained, entirely his. She met it. She always met it. Always met. This was not the life she had planned. It was the life she had earned word by word and day by day and stitch by stitch in a cabin on a mountain that had not asked for her and could not now imagine being without her. And that all of that, every hard and honest and irreplaceable piece of it, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.